This video will cover part 1 of chapter 1, the science of psychology, for PSY 110S, the psychological sciences. In this chapter, what we'll be covering is first, defining what psychology is, because there are a lot of misconceptions and assumptions that we tend to make based on our cultural background of what psychology is, what people who study psychology study, and what they do with their time as professionals. We're also going to look at the 4 major research perspectives that are covered in your textbook, the Griggs and Jackson 2020 Introduction to Psychology textbook. Then we will look at research methods that are typically used by psychologists. And finally, in a later portion, an additional video, we will talk about how statistics are involved in interpreting and making sense of research findings. So to start things off, we need a working definition of what psychology is. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of misconceptions about psychology. Mostly when I talk to students who are coming into an intro course and they don't have a background in psychology, their assumptions tend to be that psychology is the field that produces people who are in the helping professions, like psychologists and psychiatrists and so on. While that is true, that individuals with those interests may go on to be counselors or seek medical degrees and then specialize in psychiatry, that is not the entirety of what the field is about. So we need a working definition. The definition that's presented in your textbook is that psychology is basically the science of behavior and mental processes. So what they're including there is what you can see in terms of the behavior of people as they conduct their lives and across their lifespans. And then mental processes includes cognitive processes, thinking, problem solving, and so on. Now, what psychologists study, and I'm adding in emotion there, my guess is that your authors include the experience of emotion with mental processes, but also observable behaviors. The way I look at psychology, what we study, we study thinking or cognition, we study feeling or emotion, and we study action or behavior. So you'll hear me a lot during this course talk about thoughts, feelings, and actions, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, because that's really, those are the 3 domains that I believe make up the human experience. Now, your authors cover what they refer to as 4 major research perspectives. Understand that these are not the entirety of basic research approaches within psychology. There are a lot of different areas of study, but for the purposes of an intro course, it's helpful to kind of narrow your focus. And what your authors have done is to talk about emphasizing what they refer to as internal factors versus external factors. And by doing that, what they're saying is there are some things about the human experience that are generated from within the person, within their physical body. And then there are things that have an influence over our thinking, our behaviors, our emotions that come from the outside. So it could be other people, it could be the environment. So the 4 major research perspectives that Griggs and Jackson cover are include the biological and cognitive approaches, which emphasize internal factors, and then the behavioral and sociocultural approaches, which emphasize external factors. So we'll start with the major perspectives that focus on internal factors, and in that category, we'll start with the biological perspective. So in this case, what we're referring to is theories, perspectives, research programs that emphasize how our bodies, our brains, our nervous systems affect how we think, how we feel, how we act. And this can include all kinds of things, everything from evolutionary arguments about how human beings got to be the way they are to the very micro factors like how do neurons function, and everything in between. So as your authors put it, they talk about how our physiology, the brain and nervous system, produces thoughts, how it produces behaviors, how it produces emotions. And then also looking at genetic influences and evolutionary influences as well. So, just to give you an example to play with in mind, if you were asked the question, how would the biological perspective explain the experience of depression or the cause of depression? People working from a biological perspective are most likely to focus on neuroanatomy, neurochemistry, genetics, for example. Just to further the example, we know that for some forms of depression, there is a genetic component. You can have serious depression, referred to in clinical circles as major depression. There is a significant genetic component where depression can run in families. There are also neuroanatomical differences that can be detected specifically in the area of, again, major depression that is treatment resistant. You can see on brain scans, for example, anatomical differences. And then there are lots of theories about neurochemical differences in neurotransmitters that are evident when you compare people with serious depression versus those who do not have it. In terms of the cognitive perspective, and cognition includes all kinds of things like what you see on this graphic, attention, language, learning, thought, perception, memory, all of those things that we use as human beings to make sense of the world around us, to plan, to problem solve, to communicate, and so on. So the cognitive perspective emphasizes how we use these mental processes, memory, problem solving, perception, etc., as we navigate our social world. How do we think about ourselves and think about other people, think about the world and our place in it? How do our emotions connect to those mental processes of thinking? And how do those decisions, those strategies, how does our memory impact our behavior? Cognitive psychologists study all kinds of thinking processes. In later chapters, when we talk about memory, perception, when we talk about intelligence and things like IQ, all of those are topics of study in cognitive psychology. To further our example from the previous slide, how would a cognitive scientist explain depression? Just to expand the example, a cognitive psychologist may be very interested in the way in which people with depressive illness tend to think. So, for example, it's a well understood pattern in depressive illness that people with depression tend to exhibit pretty reliable patterns of negative thinking. And the way in which they talk about themselves and to themselves about their experiences tend to be pretty negative. For instance, using what's referred to as all or none thinking, where if you have one bad day, all days are bad. If you do one thing that you regret all things about who and what you are. They may also look at the way in which people explain events. So, for example, if someone is depressed and they meet the clinical criteria for depression, they may interpret the things that go on around them. In other words, they will make attributions about their world and their own behaviors that are predicted by that depressed mood. So, for example, if a student who is clinically depressed doesn't pass an exam, they may interpret that as being due to their own stupidity, which is, a very global assumption that is typical in depressive illness. Now, shifting to external factors, the behavioral perspective tends to emphasize how forces from your environment shape your behavior, but also how it shapes how you think and how you feel. So the behavioral perspective, since, one of the major approaches within that perspective is learning theory, if we're going to look at our example of how would someone working from the behavioral perspective explain depression, they would look at how that person has been exposed to a learning situation that reinforces their experience of depression, or how have that person's learning experiences made them feel helpless and hopeless. So there's a whole research area in what's referred to as learned helplessness, where people who suffer from long-term abuse and neglect may actually acquire a form of helplessness that is strongly associated with depression symptoms. Also, if you think about inappropriate forms of punishment, such as abuse and maltreatment, that is also strongly associated with experiences of depression, and so on. So the person who's working from that behavioral point of view would likely focus on the way in which people experience reinforcements, punishments, and other kinds of behavioral feedback, and the way it is associated with not just behavior, but also cognition and emotion. And then finally, the sociocultural perspective really emphasizes the way in which the context that we live in, so our culture, our community, our time, if you want to make generational comparisons, for example, how all of those things impact the way we think, feel, and act. So, for example, if you're taking a sociocultural perspective and you want to understand depression, you could ask questions about how some social groups, if they are chronically exposed to negative treatment within their cultural context, such as prejudice and discrimination, we know from the research literature that those individuals who are exposed to that kind of treatment tend to experience higher rates of depression. Also, we know from the research literature that things like poverty and natural disasters and warfare in your environment are also associated with depression as well. Now, many of you may be thinking, you may have heard in the news media that people in your generation are facing unprecedented rates of depression and anxiety. The sociocultural approach would largely look at what is it that's going on in our culture right now that is increasing those rates of depression and anxiety. So you could look at things like social media, exposure to things like global warming that have people anxious and worried, having grown up with the pandemic, that is an experience that unites your generation and has been found to be associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety. So that's the sociocultural perspective. Now, each of these perspectives, none of them is better than the others. They work in a collective. They are complementary to one another. You can't really fully understand human experience unless you use multiple perspectives. Now, not everybody believes that, but generally speaking, it is agreed among psychological scientists that we really need to understand the biology. We need to understand the cognitive. We need to understand psychophysics. We need to understand ourselves as social creatures, and so on. So when psychologists use all four perspectives, or more broadly, multiple perspectives, it helps us to ask more. It helps us to ask more questions, and it gives us a more complete understanding of behavior and mental processes. So basically, if you want to have a full understanding of psychological phenomena, you need all the perspectives. And that concludes part 1 of my coverage of Chapter 1, The Science of Psychology.